going to move on to the question of gambling policy in Britain. So to start with, how would you summarise the British government's policy towards gambling over the past 15 years? You mentioned the ideological stance that Gordon Brown took on gambling. Do you think this is representative of the way that the British government has treated gambling in recent decades?
Yeah, but the interesting thing, if you look at it over the last 15 years, as opposed to one incoming Prime Minister at one point in time, it's quite clear that there's been a policy of basically liberalisation and deregulation. I think what you see around the world is that governments have woken up to the fact that gambling is a fantastic way to raise the state's coffers in a way that people don't see that you're raising taxes. And when you put taxes on gambling, people don't see it as a tax. The irony is, of course, there are some forms of gambling that are claimed to be regressive forms of taxation. So a lottery, for instance, most people, well, for all the research points to the fact that lottery players, it's the lower socioeconomic groups that spend far more of their disposable income playing the lottery, and therefore there's a disproportionate amount of taxation goes back from those that can least afford to do it.
Tax on the poor.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, there was a lovely Viz. Viz have their top tips. They had a tip for John Major, who was the Prime Minister at the time. It was something like, why don't you have a tax on the what's it called? Why don't you have a tax on the everyone that's innumerate? Call it the National Lottery. And that's the thing. See, people just really don't understand. Sorry, I'm straying off policy here, but I mean, people just basically don't understand what 1 in 14 million actually is. Giving somebody the odds, which you should do in terms of being socially responsible, but you would get better odds of Elvis landing on the moon on the back of the Loch Ness Monster. I mean, 1 in 14 million. I mean, we've done surveys. There's other surveys being done showing that people think if they put the same numbers for the rest of their life on the National Lottery, their numbers will come up at some point. I mean, that is a tribute to public innumeracy in terms of not understanding what 1 in 14 million actually means. But anyway, I mean, going back to policy, the basic British policy has been to liberalise and to deregulate, mainly because it's a way of bringing in extra money, and it doesn't affect the typical base rate of tax that people are paying. Now, I personally think that in terms of things like super casinos and more gambling opportunities, you will see more and more happening. I mean, the bottom line now is that there's so many debates, for instance, about whether there should be more bookmakers on the high street. I mean, I do court case after court case in terms of betting shop applications. Now, the thing is that, adding one more betting shop in an area where there's 6 already makes no difference to problem gambling, particularly when basically people have got hundreds of bookmakers on their mobile phone or in their home or workplace. The fact is, an offline high street bookmaker has far more in terms of protective social measures to stop problem gambling than anything online, and that's why I just think the arguments are null and void now about the opening of more and more offline opportunities, because there are just masses online. But really, I mean, the whole policy has been what I call the drip, drip, drip effect. Occasionally you get these little bumps where there's at the moment there is a lot of talk about reducing the number of betting shops in the high street. This looks like it's an anti-gambling policy. Hilary Benn has recently said it's even not about, he just wants to see a reduction, because he says the high streets don't look very good for having bookmakers in it. It's not even an argument about causing problems. He's just saying that high streets shouldn't have bookmakers because they don't look very good on the high street. But the policy is, and will continue to be, liberalisation and deregulation until, of course, something happens where there's a public backlash. You get these cycles of kind of prohibition and deregulation. You see it with alcohol, you see it with drugs, you see it with gambling. It's amazing what happens around the world. Like, for instance, Canada, they pour more money into gambling research, gambling education, gambling prevention than any other country in the world that I can think of. And it all started when basically a senior minister's son in one particular jurisdiction tried to commit suicide because of his gambling problems. Then, of course, that was in Quebec. So Quebec said, right, we're going to put $10 million aside for research into gambling and for treatment and prevention. As soon as Quebec put 10 million, Ontario said, well, we're going to put in 12 million. As soon as Ontario put in 12 million, British Columbia said, well, we're going to put in 14 million. There's so much competitiveness between the states about being seen as being, doing something good. So, you know, people like one of my colleagues, for instance, I published a lot of papers, that he's moved over to Canada because they're awash with money for, you know, research, prevention and education. You know, I mean, that's an example of where one event has kind of kick-started a whole sequence of having a country that's very well funded for researching in this area.
What do you believe is the government's primary agenda in regards to gambling legislation? A 2010 Deloitte study revealed that the industry generates £700 million a year in taxes, and presumably that's increased with the proliferation of things like mobile gambling. So, is the government's primary concern when it legislates in ways that restrict the gambling industry to protect players, or are they simply trying to generate taxation?
What I've already said is that most governments are aware that if you basically tax gambling, lots of money comes in,
yeah.
And that's why most countries. Now, obviously, Britain's no different from that in the sense that there's you know, people want to gamble. We'll legally provide gambling opportunities and to do so, but we'll also take a cut of the profits that you make. Having said that, the Gambling Commission will say that, you know, we're not going to allow this to happen unless we can show that you know, it isn't an avenue for crime, that children and vulnerable people aren't exploited, that harm minimisation and player protection measures are in place. You know, I don't think the government would want to do anything where it negatively impacted on society. All these decisions, they kind of make a cost-benefit analysis of what the positives versus negatives. I personally believe that in most gambling situations, the positives outweigh the negatives. You know, if that wasn't the case, we wouldn't have mass gambling everywhere. You know, the bottom line is that most people who gamble do not have problems. Most people who drink alcohol do not have problems. That's not to say that those small minority don't occur and that we shouldn't think about protecting those vulnerable and susceptible people.
How do you interpret the debate between pro-gambling lobbies and those people and organisations calling for further impositions and restrictions on the gambling industry? I mean, where do those voices come from and what kind of positions do they tend to take?
Well, the thing is, any consumptive industry, whether it's nicotine, whether it's drinking, whether it's gambling, you'll always get people on, you know, diametrically opposed in terms of whether we should be offering this product or this service to the nation as a whole. Obviously, in terms of the kind of anti-gambling lobby, a lot of it comes from either religious beliefs or beliefs that are founded on, you know, personal experiences of the people that have undergone that. I think we live in a mature society now, and that, you know, gambling has always been around. You know, trying to, for instance, limit it or, you know, basically prohibit it means it just gets taken underground. I think we have a very mature attitude that the vast majority of the British public, if you include the lottery, do gamble. Even if they might not think they're gambling, we quite clearly are, you know, more of a nation of gamblers and not a nation of gamblers. Obviously, you know, we know that in terms of the gambling lobbying industry, there are lots of connections between, you know, government departments. I think what was quite interesting, I've twice been on the all-party gambling scrutiny committee. There are, you know, last time I went up before them, I think there were 21 members, and 18 of those members, in terms of conflict of interest, 18 out of the 21 held directorships of gambling companies, were non-executive directors of gambling companies, you know, lobbied on behalf of the gambling industry. You know, it just seems to me, in terms of, you know, potential for corruption to happen, people can look at that and say, you know, the only people sitting on this committee are those who have a vested interest in the continuance of the gambling industry. But having said that, you know, if the public really didn't want lots of gambling opportunities, you would find that at the ballot box, basically. And, you know, the bottom line is that most people don't have a really strong opinion on whether gambling should be I think most people wouldn't want gambling to be prohibited. It's just, you know, it's a knee-jerk reaction that wouldn't serve anybody. Having said that, we are living in an age where people can gamble more on lots of different things that we never imagined when legislation was first introduced. You know, when, you know, that last National Lottery Act came in, I think nobody could foresee mass internet gambling, gambling via mobile phones, gambling on interactive television. So I mean, legislation, you know, always seems to be 2 steps behind technological innovation, and obviously with technological innovation, that usually is about increasing the participation rates in gambling somehow, and therefore we do have to have, you know, what I would describe as responsible gambling measures in place to help minimise the harm.
Now, in your work and in this interview, you've already acknowledged concerns surrounding fixed odds betting terminals, but you say they shouldn't be banned. Can you please explain this position for us?
I don't believe any I don't think any form of gambling should be banned unless there is scientific evidence that it affects far more than it well, in terms of, again, it's kind of positives and negatives. The point is, fixed odds betting terminals are located within bookmakers' shops or occasionally within some casinos. Okay, these are dedicated gambling environments. You can't walk into a bookmakers and not expect gambling experiences and gambling products to be offered for people to play. Now, obviously, the debate around fixed odds betting terminals is that people can lose huge amounts of money in a very short amount of time. The bookmaking industry, believe it or not, have listened to these concerns, and I know for a fact because I've just redrafted the Association of British Bookmakers Code of Conduct on Social Responsibility, and anyone who now wants to be a member of the Associated British Bookmakers will now have to put limit-setting features on its fixed odds betting terminals, which will mean that people have to make a pre-commitment in terms of how much they're prepared to lose in terms of money and in terms of time. Now, to me, this seems an ideal situation. The thing about most forms of gambling is that when you're in the midst of gambling, when you're actually there gambling, is that rationality goes out the window. The adrenaline's pumping, you feel completely different than when you make a cold decision and you step back and make a decision. Most people who pre-commit, if they say, I don't want to lose more than £50 a month on a fixed odds betting terminal, is that they'll be able to, in the very near future, is they'll be able to, on a fixed odds betting terminal, be able to set the limits that they're prepared to lose. Once you reach those limits, you can't play them anymore. Now, it doesn't stop them then going to another shop and gambling there. And of course, in any of this kind of situation, you're only as strong as your weakest link. But to be honest, you can play fixed odds betting terminal type games on the internet all day long. You can self-exclude from one site and just go on to another. People have got to take some responsibility for their own gambling actions. My concerns is that, I wouldn't be advertising fixed odds betting terminals in the middle of Coronation Street. I would just want a sensible advertising and marketing policy around particular forms of gambling. We know that, based on what I said to you earlier, is that the structural characteristics of an FOBT are such that to a vulnerable or susceptible people, that will increase the chances they could develop a problem with that type of game, because it's something you can play over and over and over again. But that's not to ban them. Loads of people play slot machines, play fixed odds betting terminals, have no problem whatsoever. Banning just isn't the way forward, because what that would do is there would just be an underground market for FOBTs, because people who want to play them will find other places to play them. So it's about the industry taking more responsibility in terms of protecting, knowing that their product. It's a bit like alcohol. Every alcohol bottle has the percentage proof on, and the drink aware campaign. Gambling has to do the same. Is they have to make people aware of all the potential problems so that people can make an informed choice about whether they want to play them in the first place.
Well, that segues quite nicely into the last question.
Okay.
Gambling advertising has come under a lot of scrutiny over the past year. The BBC reported on a Coral advert being inadvertently screened on a children's television channel. You can't even watch a football match these days without being bombarded with gambling ads during the intervals. So, who do you think should take responsibility for this sometimes unethical advertising? Gambling operators or the media? And sort of following on from that, how do you think the government should be looking to regulate gambling advertising?
Okay, there's a number of issues there. The first thing is we have very strict guidelines that the Advertising Standards Authorities set out. Not only that, is that the Gambling Commission also have their own set of guidelines about what should and shouldn't be in particular adverts. So, for instance, nobody under the age of 25 is supposed to be in an advert. There should be nothing about that gambling will solve life's problems in any way. So, for instance, there was a particularly, what I think, despicable campaign that was run in France. Eric Cantona was the front for the Partouche company, and their strapline is "Bet to Forget." Now, for me, that is just socially irresponsible in terms of what gambling should be about. We had one recently here in this country, the health lottery, and there all the advert, there was a lot of complaints about it, and it said mortgage, what mortgage, with the health lottery advertising. Again, the idea that gambling is going to solve all your financial problems should never be used in adverts. Now, I'm a believer that the gambling, we live in a grown-up, mature society. I personally believe that the gambling industry should have a right to market and advertise their products, but it should be done in a way that kind of looks at the scientific evidence for associations of problems with those particular activities. So, for instance, there is no evidence that the National Lottery causes any problems at all, really. You get the odd person that maybe spends too much in terms of the amount of tickets, but really there shouldn't be. I mean, I'm happy to see the National Lottery advertised in the middle of Coronation Street. It's a discontinuous form of activity that doesn't tend to cause problems. I have more problems, for instance, having scratch cards advertised. Now, the interesting thing was, this is a true story. In 1996, the Home Office produced a document. It was a consultation document, and they defined the idea of this difference between hard and soft gambling. It was particularly related to advertising, because basically they were saying is that the situation we've got now with the lottery is that we'll allow soft forms of gambling to be advertised on television. Now, and the definition of a hard form of gambling, and I mentioned it earlier, was that basically that hard gambling was defined as any activity that involved high or rapid staking. Now, I wrote to the Home Office and I said to them, I've just seen your new definition of what a hard form of gambling is, and by that definition, scratch cards are a hard form of gambling, yet you're advertising it, you know, through every programme on ITV in a typical night. They wrote back to me and said, "Dear Dr Griffiths, thank you for your letter. I can assure you that scratch cards are not a hard form of gambling because they are sold in respectable outlets." So I wrote back and said, does that mean if we put a roulette wheel in Tesco, it suddenly becomes a soft form of gambling? Of course, they didn't bother to answer that particular one. The idea that where you sell something defines what is a hard or soft form of gambling is ludicrous. But in terms of advertising, we've now got a situation, because of the Gambling Act, that's the one major difference people will have realised from the Gambling Act, is that the freedom to advertise loads of different forms of gambling activity is widespread now. If you sit down tonight, if there's not a football match on TV, what you'll get is that before 10 o'clock, loads of adverts for online bingo, then after 10 o'clock, loads of adverts for online casinos and online poker, obviously targeting women before the 10 o'clock watershed kind of thing, and men after the 10:30 watershed. In adult programming, I haven't got a problem. Okay, but my kids, they're typically at least up until 9 o'clock. I don't think they should be bombarded with adverts. So I do think that in terms of advertising and marketing, is that it can be advertised to adults in arenas where adults would normally be doing things. But I personally, my own personal opinion is it shouldn't be in a situation where lots of children or adolescents can watch it.
So we've already ascertained that you feel it's socially irresponsible to advertise gambling at times in which underage viewers might encounter gambling advertising. Do you feel that at the same time gambling brands are socially irresponsible when they advertise on the billboards of major sporting events which are broadcast during the day when children might see them?
Well, the thing is, at the moment, we have a loophole in the law which means that even during the day, if there's a major sporting event, companies like Bet365, William Hill and Corals can advertise their gambling products before and during a football match. Personally, I don't think that's right. I know I've got 3 children myself. I don't like it that they're bombarded with gambling advertising. The thing is, they've got a father who's a professor of gambling studies, and I can actually explain to them, the ins and outs of gambling. So for instance, we had a situation recently when my son did say to me that he said Van Persie was going to score a hat-trick for Man United in this particular game, and he did. And he said to me, if I'd have put the bet on that, I would have won whatever the amount of money was. And I said, what about all the times you said to me that Rooney was going to score, that, and I went through all these things, you're only remembering the one that you would have won. I mean, this is what happens with gambling all the time. So now the thing about things like billboards at sporting matches, I mean, that you're not going to stop that. My guess is that most people really are watching the game rather than watching the electronic adverts that are flashing across the billboards. Same with when you're watching a game. Hopefully most people are watching the game rather than the adverts there. I mean, sport and betting are inextricably linked. You can't stop it. If you look at, for instance, when Manchester United, I think, were sponsored by Vodafone at one point, and they were discussing how Vodafone and online gambling services could be linked to the Manchester United faithful. Those kind of link-ups are going to happen more and more. Obviously, a lot of gambling firms sponsor football clubs. I mean, there is a little bit of concession there, is that football clubs won't sell a children's shirt that's got a gambling sponsor on it. That's not to say the children can't see who's the gambling sponsor. Some of them they may not even realise are a gambling sponsor. So here in Nottingham we have Victor Chandler supporting Nottingham Forest. My guess is most kids don't know that Victor Chandler is a betting outlet. But the thing is, you can't stop this, and there has to be some parental responsibility in educating your children. But I personally, and I've said this for a long time, Gambling's an adult activity. If we're going to advertise and market it, it has to be to adults. And for me, I think an easy way to start, won't eliminate it, but after the 9 o'clock watershed would be a good place to start.